Hi, and this is the Physics High podcast. A quick quiz. Do you A, want to be inspired by science communicators? B, want to learn all about science education? C, want guidance on your scientific journey? Well, how about D, all of the above? Today my guest is Michael Gregory. Now Michael is a Canadian who currently resides in Paris in France, and he's a science teacher. Now in 2017 he decided to get on his bike from San Francisco and ride north to Canada and then across it, a total of 10,000 kilometers. Why? He wanted to meet other science teachers and get them to share some of their favorite experiments. And as a result, he collated a number of videos, meeting over 100 teachers that he now puts on his YouTube channel. Since then, he's traveled to multiple countries, over 32 countries, again visiting teachers from around the world to get them to share their ideas. And he currently runs science camps online, again with students from around the world. But it's not me to tell you his story. I'm going to let Michael share his story. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Paul. It's nice to meet you. Thank you for inviting me on as part of this project.
Tell us a little bit about your journey. You're doing science camps, but the journey really started in 2017 when you started bike riding. Can you give us a little of an overview of what drove you to take this journey?
I'd love to. So to start off, it probably makes sense to explain why I decided to do it in the first place. So a bit of background on that. I grew up in Canada, and that's where I first learned science and got my love of science. That's also where I first learned to be a science teacher. After being in Canada, I worked in the UK and then in France. And I often noticed that teachers from different places had different sets of experiments they used to teach the same science concepts. I look at it that science is universal, but how we teach it can vary widely from one language, culture, or just region to another. And I came up with an idea to try and explain it. I liken it to diseases and the spread of disease, so I call it the disease model for the spread of ideas. And the basic idea is that a new idea for an experiment can pop up, usually in the mind of a teacher, and if it works well, they'll spread it to teachers around them. So it'll spread point to point, and something that works well will eventually spread to a whole school, maybe a town, a region, and it takes much longer to jump other barriers, either from one country to another, from one curriculum to another, or a language to another. So you get these pockets of really great ideas that haven't yet jumped to another area to spread. So I got the idea, wouldn't it be great if I became a vector for the spread of good ideas? And I went from place to place, gathering everyone's favorite experiments and sharing it forwards to the other places. And so that was the basic idea behind it. In 2017, there were a number of things going on in my life, and it was also the 150th anniversary of Canada. So there were a number of celebrations across the country. And I decided, wouldn't that be a great time to go back and see the country I grew up in and get ideas from as many teachers as possible? At the same time, I was invited to attend a workshop at the Exploratorium where I've attended a number of amazing things. So I didn't want to cut that out of the plan, so I included a short 2,000-kilometer warm-up up the Pacific coast from the Exploratorium to fit that in. And that ride across Canada was an amazing experience where I met a number of different educators in schools, in museums, at universities. And when I got back to Paris, it had completely revolutionized my teaching practice. I had all these ideas fresh to teach my students, and to get them to share forwards with others as well through a science outreach club I modeled after a similar club I had seen in Canada. And as the school year went on, I got to thinking, well, wouldn't it be great to continue this project? But in Europe, it's a lot smaller in terms of landmass, a lot more dense in terms of population, but also in terms of different countries, different curricula, different languages. So I decided to continue the project in Europe. And in 2018, biked through 20 different European countries. Again, about 10,000 kilometers. That seems to be kind of a maximum that I can fit into a couple months of biking if I'm taking time to meet teachers, go to museums, and a bunch of other stuff along the way. And then I had a whole bunch of contacts across Europe where I decided, well, after that, I gathered a whole bunch of ideas, and I'd keep asking the same question to share their favorite experiments with me. But also it was time to do more things to share my ideas forwards. So 2019, I spent some time volunteering at UNESCO. That was a lot more administrative than what I really like with experiments, but still a good experience. And I took the time to go back to a number of places where I had seen the most interesting projects. Like in Spain, there were some very interesting kind of experiment sharing projects. In Serbia, there's an amazing teacher who was welcoming teachers from all around the world to give guest lessons at schools in his area. I've been back twice since. I was going to bring students there. I started volunteer teaching in Ghana with a teacher I'd met at CERN in 2018. Even brought students there. And again, everywhere I went, not only was I sharing ideas for us, I was gathering a lot more ideas for myself. And this kind of sets the stage. So that was 2019, and 2020 started off really well. But March 2020 was an interesting month for people around the world. And when Paris went into a lockdown, you can probably tell from the story I've told so far, staying inside, not going out really isn't something I do very well. So I didn't have an easy time at all when we were told we weren't allowed to leave home. I canceled. First trip to be canceled was a trip with students to Serbia scheduled for April. I was going to go back to Ghana with students last summer, but that was canceled as well. And I kept trying to come up with ways that I could do something interesting and useful without leaving home. And it wasn't easy. The idea for the virtual camps didn't come until the second week of the lockdown. And I'd gone through similar to when I'm biking somewhere and I try and find interesting people to meet. Most of the time, I either get ignored or rejected. And I have the idea that if 1 out of 5 people or 1 out of 10 people will lead to me meeting someone interesting where we share ideas back and forth, then it's worth contacting 10 or 20 or 50 people, and then I get to meet 5 really interesting people. And there might be 40 or 50 who ignore me. Same thing, trying to come up with ideas during the lockdown for things I could do. Let's try and do 10 amazing things, and hopefully at least one will work out. So amongst the many different things I tried, so I contacted all roommates who were doctors and asked, is there anything I could do to help out at a hospital? I'm not scared if I get sick. Said, no, we're only looking for people with medical experience. You don't have that. So I contacted a bunch of people at the Pasteur Institute who were working overtime researching like mad. And I said, is there anything I can do for you guys? Even help share with the public what you're doing? They said, no, we have our own communication teams. You don't have research experience. We're not interested in what you're doing. And so by the time I finally got the idea for virtual science camps, and the inspiration kind of came from a friend. She had her kids following ballet classes from some famous ballet in New York. And she was saying, yeah, couldn't you do science experiments like that and get kids to join? And I thought, yeah, that's finally the idea. Now I know I'm not trained in medicine. I'm not trained in research. I'm not good at parenting skills, but I know how to do science. And I have years of practice putting together experiments with very basic materials. So I just got to come up with a plan for how kids can use basic materials from around the home, and they can be doing hands-on science. Got the help of the Parents Association of my school to send out a message. One day, after opening sign-ups, there were over 100 families who signed up for these. And then, at the end of the weekend, just before the first camp, I got a message from the head of my school who reminded me that I'd only been informed a day before that I was retroactively laid off because my gifted workshops were canceled. And I was informed it would be illegal for me to run virtual camps for the parents because I'm no longer employed by the school for the time. And so this was a big worry and a big disappointment. So I spent over an hour on the phone with the Human Resources Department and eventually came up with the idea where as long as I wasn't portraying myself as representing my school and the participants weren't a majority from my school, then there shouldn't be any legal trouble there. And so that was the kind of last piece of the puzzle. And the really cool thing, how it became so international, these camps. I was scrambling to get as many people as possible from outside of my school to participate. So through my favorite experiments, like biking across Europe, biking across Canada, connecting with a bunch of teachers, I had a lot of contacts in different countries in education. So I sent out desperate, frantic messages to all of them saying, I'm starting these new virtual camps. I really need participants. Please tell your students, please tell your colleagues, send people my way. And I managed to get things just like barely at a level where it was more than half kids from my school, and I was able to keep going with these things. It was a bit of a rocky road at times, but I got some very good encouragement from people, including parents who said, well, the teachers at my school, they gave up trying to teach anything. We just have handouts for the kids to do, and it's amazing that you're able to get kids actually doing hands-on science. Or some of the most encouraging was from teachers who attended. And I have a friend in Germany who his school and his school board, German privacy laws are pretty strict. And so they weren't having any video lessons. And he invited his head of school and then someone from like the regional Department of Education to attend my camps. And those ended up influencing their decision to start video lessons for their region. So being able to see that there was an impact with not only students locally at my school, but teachers around the world, that was kind of like the biggest reward from doing this. And even to this day, it's roughly stable with about a third of my participants being students from Paris, mostly from my school, but from around Paris, about a third from all around the world, and about a third of the participants are teachers, either checking things out to recommend to their students or looking for new ideas. And it's been really amazing being able to have an open door, inviting colleagues from all around the world to come in and check out what I'm doing. And that's something that never would have been possible, not only like 10 years ago before video conferencing technology got accessible to the level it is today, but also before 2020 when people by necessity were doing video conferences and like video lessons as much. There never would have been interest to check out what someone else is doing. So I think that's a really important part of a number of projects that people do. A lot of teachers are just trying to survive the current situation and trying to do what they've been doing up until this point. Whereas I think with change comes difficulty, but also new opportunity. And so it's worth seeking out how can we make our teaching even better than it has been before? Or what new opportunities have come and how can we take advantage of these opportunities? That's really a key with what I feel I'm trying to do here. And the main thing I'm trying to share with teachers is just do the best you can and don't get stuck in what teaching looked like a year ago or 2 years ago. Take advantage of the new opportunities that present themselves.
From a bike ride, you now have international exposure and encouraging students to keep up with science and other teachers as well, to encourage them as well. That's a great story. How did you get into science? What drove you to follow a career in science?
So it depends on whether it's science in general or science teaching. But I always had an interest in science, but as a kid growing up, I had an interest in almost everything. I really liked writing, I liked drama, I liked acting, I liked sports, and science was just one of the things. But as I was in high school and getting near the end of high school, I was advised that if you're good at science, you may as well take as many science classes as you can, because if you want to go to university, you can't study science there if you've studied something else, whereas almost anything else, they'll probably let you in if you study science. And so it was almost by like accident or mistake that I ended up studying science at university and continuing with it. And again, it was almost by mistake I went into education. I was a summer camp counselor, and I liked working with kids and like teaching them, but teaching in an informal setting. And my plan when I initially went into teaching was I'd do that for half a decade or a decade, and then I'd be able to keep going to summer camp and work as a camp counselor in the summer. And I hadn't thought of it as a long-term thing until, and that's where my seminal moments come in, so kind of a long lead up to that. Some of the biggest moments that convinced me that, wow, this is really something that I want to do and that I can potentially be very good at were from encouragement and mentors who modeled really good science teaching. So in my first year teaching, I had a mentor, Peter Darmady, in Wick, Scotland. And at that point, that was near the end of my first year teaching, and I was considering quitting right after the first year because I'd been in England. Some schools in England are awful. And at this school, there's this amazing teacher who had the idea that, okay, we're teaching physics, but the main thing we're teaching these kids is how to be a productive member of society, or like how to interact with other people without fighting, without running out of the classroom, things like that. And so we should make the science as interesting and as interactive as possible. So he had this program called Fun Physics. And in most schools that aren't particularly academic, there's very little enrollment in physics. And most students who have to pick a science, they'll pick biology, or if earth science is an option. Whereas here with his Fun Physics program, it was by far the most popular science program. And he directly was responsible for a lot of kids staying in school once they turned 16, because you're allowed to leave school there once you turn 16. In that town, most kids did. Like on their 16th birthday, then they go into school, give the teachers the finger, and leave. And through Fun Physics, he managed to get a lot of kids staying on and getting their high school credentials. And so learning from him was one of the big turning points in my career. There have been a couple others like that with a couple other mentors, like Paul Doherty at the Exploratorium, who I mentioned before we started recording the interview. And he had a way of lighting up anytime a teacher would come to him with an idea. And this guy had been in science education for decades. He had heard tons of ideas, but the enthusiasm he had for anyone who'd come with a new idea was so rewarding and so gratifying. Talking to a lot of people who had known him well, we all had the same impression where we felt like we were his favorite. And then realizing that everyone felt like his favorite, that didn't take away from being his favorite at all. If anything, it made it even greater because we all felt that special connection with him, and he was able to do that. And so like getting back to what got me into science, I went into science education almost by accident, but I really stuck with it and like got fully into it, wanting to be more like some of these amazing mentors I've had.
Isn't that the case that it's our educators, our teachers who often inspire us to go where we end up going? I share a similar story. I can very much relate. I went into university sort of going into science, but actually I almost fell into education. And I ended up loving it. And I actually see myself more as a science communicator, science educator, than a scientist or a science person. I also had a supervising teacher in my last year of learning how to be a teacher. His name was Tom Everson. And he was an inspirational educator who was extremely encouraging in what I was doing in the classroom. That leads us to a really important question, I think. How do you see yourself and the importance of your role as a science communicator, not only to your students, but to the world at large?
That's an excellent question, and not necessarily an easy question. And an interesting thing about science communication, unless I've misunderstood something completely, it seems to be a relatively new vocation. There have always been people interested in sharing things about science, and like some amazing historical examples as well of people who communicated really well about science. But that, it's now something where someone could say, oh, when I grow up, I want to be a science communicator. Whereas for me, it still seems to be a very ill-defined thing. It's just someone who shares something about science. So one of the things that I ask myself is, how can you become one? And even now, I'm not sure if I can properly qualify myself as a science communicator. I hope so. But a couple of years ago, when I was starting out my YouTube channel and when I was starting to meet more teachers, sometimes I'd introduce myself as an aspiring science communicator or a teacher wanting to become a science communicator. And if you define it that like to be a professional science communicator, I'm assuming you'd need to get paid for it. And so far, I'm still only paid for my teaching. Like, it's not anything I've sought to earn money for. And so I still don't really have my head around what science communication is.
I agree. It's a title, and I think in today's multimedia age, you'll have a lot more science communicators doing documentaries, YouTube, and so forth. I think we, as science educators, we hold a responsibility to communicate science and how science works. It's beholden to us to communicate what we know and how science works. I guess where this question, I guess, is leading is that you don't have to turn on the TV for very, very long to find examples of where scientific literacy is poor at best. I think as science communicators, we are to encourage the people around us to say, look, this is science, this is how evidence works, this is how models work, and so forth, so that we can actually make better decisions.
Definitely. And I think one of the things you hinted on was we could say that we have kind of a science literacy problem or science literacy crisis on our hands. And I would say, in my opinion, two of the biggest problems or two of the biggest causes of that are the impression that science is too difficult or complicated to understand and that it's too boring. And so we have a lot of people, especially as adults now, but a lot of this was learned in school as a kid, they kind of turn off whenever they hear anything science related, and they say, oh, well, that's not for me to figure out. The scientists will do that, and then they'll tell me what they have to tell me, and I'll be bored, and I may or may not do it, but I'm not going to attempt to understand it. So I think one of our two biggest responsibilities there are to engage interest, both from a young age and in the general public, but also to make science more accessible. So, and that's something you see, especially with like some of the really great scientists. If someone really understands something well, they should be able to understand it well to explain it at any level. And it's only when you're trying to tackle something that's beyond your level of understanding that you'll fall back on the relatively poor excuse, oh, it's too complicated, I can't explain it. So I think the biggest thing science communicators can do, and a lot of them do extremely well, is to make science, for one, interesting, so people are interested in hearing more about it, but also to make it accessible, and not to get rid of like meaningful or essential parts of it, but to be able to pick out what the important details in a model or a situation or a test are, and communicate the essential parts without getting people too confused by not necessarily non-essential details, but there are details that can be left to the scientists.
If you've got some students in your classroom who are thinking about science and about science careers, maybe the students you're already teaching, what advice would you give them?
There's a couple of pieces of advice, but one of the ones, which isn't always a popular thing to advise students, is to consider other careers outside of science as well. Because like you had said, there's going to be a minority of the class that goes into science careers, and a lot of them would do that anyways, despite how poorly you teach or how uninspiring you are. And so if they're destined to do that, that's going to be their destiny anyways. But the students who are on the edge or who can do great things in science, imagine if they go into a non-science career and they become maybe policymakers, or they become teachers, or they become citizens of the world. And if you have a high level of science literacy or science respect for science that they share through other careers, that could potentially have a bigger impact than having these great scientific minds only focused on science. You could say is one of the reasons for our current science literacy crisis, that we tend as educators to funnel those who are interested in science into science careers, or to orient them that way. Whereas we should try and have them be productive citizens of the world in all sorts of careers who draw from science to better, to better the world, I guess.
Now on to our last question, and a bit more light-hearted question. I want to give you an opportunity to share something that you want to teach us, the audience. It could be one of your favorite experiments, or it could be something else. What would you like to teach us?
So there's so many things I'd like to teach, and I was on the fence trying to figure out, well, which one do I want to show? But I think because it's relevant to current times, I'm going to show you one on face masks. So I'd done a virtual science camp on testing face masks where we did a number of different experiments where kids at home could explore how face masks work. And I'll just show you kind of the most exciting one, but also with the biggest take-home message. So for that, I'm just going to use a candle, and hopefully anyone watching this podcast is inspired to go try this at home. So I'm going to light a candle just to test how far away my breath can go. And this is to test the aspect of face masks that they prevent or they significantly reduce airflow away from our face. So there's other tests you can do to look at the size of droplets that could get through a face mask, but small enough droplets, once they're through a mask, they're not going to travel much on still air. And we can demonstrate that. I guess I'll blow out the candle just for a sec. And I'm going to grab a piece of kitchen towel. I'm just going to make a little ball of it and a small ball of it. And provided that the balls are compact, then the physics teachers or physics-minded students among us should be able to identify that with a different size, the two things that'll change if we drop them in the air, they'll have different mass and they'll have different surface area, which will give rise to air resistance. The mass will be proportional to the cube of the diameter of the ball, whereas the surface area will be proportional to the square. So if we drastically reduce it, the effect of air resistance will be much bigger. We should see that the small one will travel much more slowly through air than the big one, provided the big one is also compact. So we can just try that there. And we can do that a couple of times because it doesn't really show up so well on camera. It's worth trying at home. But the big one falls more than the small one, which demonstrates that larger objects of similar material and similar size will be able to travel faster through air, just like water droplets leaving a mask. So if we have a small enough water droplet, it gets through a hole in the mask, then it's not going to travel very far on still air, and it's worth modeling how far air travels out of a mask. So getting back to the candle, with no mask, first of all, I'm going to see how far away I can blow out the candle. And I'm just going to see, can I blow it from an arm's length away? And most people's arms are about a meter, so from a meter away, I can blow it out quite easily. But then if I put on a face mask, so I'm going to start with a surgical disposable mask, and I'm going to try that same test and start from arm's length away and blow it in, bring it in until I can blow it out. We can see I'm barely moving the flame when it's about 10 centimeters away. And it gets to like the 5 centimeter range before there's enough airflow through the mask to blow it out. Now we can ask ourselves, because at various stages and various areas have different restrictions, but I'm going to use a homemade cotton one. This is one made by my mom's neighbor back in Canada with some nice red moose on it. And it's just regular cotton you'd use for t-shirts. And I'm going to check the airflow from this using the same test. Similar distance, maybe slightly further away. And so we get very similar results with different materials. Now, if we want to exaggerate the effect of a pretty large weave, I'm just going to skip to a very large weave. And If you want to take more time, you could have like holes that you poke in different masks. But here, you can see my face right through it. And this is just from like a vegetable packaging, like a bag of onions. And it's about 0.5 centimeter holes. And at first glance, you might think this shouldn't block any airflow. We should get it blowing out the candle from a full meter away. And let's just give it a try to see how it works. Already it's hard to direct the air right at the candle. We're getting it dancing a little bit, but it's surprisingly effective, even though you can see my face and there's big holes here. As I bring it a bit closer, it is getting a lot of air to the candle, but less than you might think with the size of the hole. I can blow it away from several times further from a mask, like a cotton mask, but we still see it's more effective than you might initially think with that. Now, if we add a couple of layers, it's still a ridiculously ineffective mask because we can still see my face and we can get like big droplets. I could spit, and probably a wad of spit could go through this. So it's not an effective mask as such, but just with 3 layers of wide hole packaging, we're going to try and blow the candle out again. And it was slightly closer. Now the take-home message, or like the next kind of final important part of this demo, I'm going to go back to the surgical mask. I'm just going to wear it like this. And probably in your part of the world, kind of depends where you are, but you might see a lot of people, even people working in the food industry or healthcare professionals, wearing a mask like this. And I want to demonstrate how effective this is at stopping airflow. And a mask worn like this is no more effective than this mask, which should seem like a ridiculous test. But if you talk about using science to inform citizens in their day-to-day life, you'll see a lot of people wearing masks like this, probably not realizing that they're only as effective as a mask like this at stopping airflow getting from them to others. And so you could make a number of conclusions or arguments from this, and I'm not a policymaker, so I'm not going to pretend I can do that effectively. But you could say that maybe if masks were more comfortable for people to wear, then you'd have them being worn more correctly, and you could have a better overall effectiveness, rather than if you have a fairly lazy enforcement of people wearing masks like this. Well, it's just one way that we can tie a fairly simple test that you can do at home to kind of understand part of our day-to-day life with a little bit of science modeling in there.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That's quite interesting, actually. You wouldn't ever think that a bit of Hessian could be as effective, or not effective, I guess, as an incorrectly worn surgical mask. And yes, I do see a lot of people wearing it that way. So I think, again, using a really simple experiment, you can actually show that its proper wearing of a surgical mask, or any mask for that matter, is always the key. Well, this has been a wonderful chat, Michael. It's been really fascinating to get to know you, particularly your adventures and in particular your inspiration. And I really hope that your science camps continue to grow, and also your videos on YouTube. And I really urge you, if you're interested in some of the people that Michael met through his journey across Canada and then across around in Europe, please look him up on his YouTube channel. My Favorite Experiment is what you're going to be searching for. Again, Michael, thanks for your time, and I hope to have another conversation with you at a later stage. Take care, and bye for now.
Thanks for having me. This has been great.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe to get notifications of up-and-coming interviews, as well as my other physics content. My name is Paul from Physics High. Till next time.